Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, welcome to the November surprise session of the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival. My name is Alexa Uda, and I cover demographics and voting rights for the Texas Tribune. We are barreling toward an election unlike any other. We're talking socially distanced lines to vote, plexiglass dividers, mega vote centers in sports arenas, no contact voting, a longer early voting period, and more mail-in voting. But these necessary alterations to the voting process also translate to new or increased challenges for some voters. It might be for someone that their regular polling place that used to be within walking distance or on their bus route might actually be relocated because it doesn't work for a socially distanced election. You might have high risk voters who cannot go to the polls now, and they have to figure out how to cover postage for their application for a mail in ballot, for the ballot itself, or for both of those things. And we know that the fallout from these sort of election issues isn't felt equally along racial or socioeconomic lines, because there are some things even a pandemic can't change. To help make sense of all of this, we're speaking today with two election administrators and two voting rights advocates on how this election might go and what we need to be thinking about and doing in preparation. Later in this session, we'll be chatting with Mimi Marziani, the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project, and Raven Douglas, the political director for Move Texas. But first, we'll talk to Chris Hollins, the Harris County clerk, and Yvonne Ramón, the elections administrator for Hidalgo County. Welcome, Chris and Yvonne. Chris Hollins was appointed county clerk for Harris County by the Commissioner's Court just this May. He previously served as vice chairman of the Texas Democratic Party and worked as an attorney. Yvonne has been running elections for Hidalgo County since 2008 as a county elections administrator. She just wrapped up a stint as the president of the Texas Association of Election Administrators. With a month and a half to go until Election Day and less than a month before the start of early voting, I know this is an insanely busy time for y'all, so let me just start by saying thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure.
I wanted to start kind of broadly because we have seen many instances of political leaders and the president himself sowing mistrust of the election process ahead of what we all know will be an unusual election given the changes that are happening because of the pandemic. And so I wanted to start by asking you all, as the people in charge of running the elections, of ensuring their integrity and making sure that everyone can cast their ballot, what is y'all's message to voters in response to some of these efforts that we've seen? And Chris, maybe we can start with you on this.
Absolutely. We all know that a core, if not the core part of our democracy is the ability for all citizens to be able to have their voices heard at the polls in free and fair elections. And it's my job as the chief elections officer of Harris County to ensure that these elections are secure and safe and convenient and accessible for the people of Harris County. And we're working very hard, myself and a team of over 300 dedicated public servants, to ensure that. And so it's disappointing to hear from government officials who are seeking to sow distrust in this system that is so core, so critical, and so sacred to our democracy.
Yvonne, what's your message to a voter who might hear that rhetoric and worry about the election?
In adding to what Chris said, absolutely. We work so hard to strive to make sure that every single voter who is supposed to vote votes in a positive and a welcoming environment. And we make sure that all the protocols that are in place, we make sure that all our numbers balance. When I'm training you poll workers, I always say, we're like a bank. At the end of the day, we balance to the penny. And that's what we do. We make sure that we start with our voter rolls. We make sure that the voter registration databases are where they need to be, making sure that the information is correct to the best of our ability. And then we go on to the election and make sure that those numbers balance as well. So any question that a voter has, I always appreciate when someone calls us with a question or with a doubt, because they are contacting the people who know best. There are the protocols that are in place, the programs that we use, the processes and reports that we have are very available to all for all to see. And anyone who comes in with a question, make sure that they leave with an answer. And so we definitely appreciate the calls and the questions, and we strive to make sure that every voter has a positive experience.
You know, when I spoke to y'all and many of your colleagues ahead of the July primary runoffs, we were talking a lot about the scrambling that was happening to get enough protective gear for poll workers, and then scrambling to confirm that those poll workers would stick it out for the whole election, particularly since we had an extended early voting period for that runoff. Obviously, that election was a much smaller endeavor than the general that we are heading into. At this point in the calendar, tell me what has been the biggest challenge you've run into so far preparing for a pandemic election on the scale of a general election? Yvonne, we'll start with you.
Definitely the added layer of fear that our community and our poll workers have is what has added to the challenge, because there is so much that is unknown. And so we went ahead and moved forward in training, and first of all, becoming informed. And that's what I did and my staff did. We read everything. We read all the guidelines, and thank you to the emergency management systems in not just our county, but throughout the state that help provide all the necessary PPEs. And then we made sure that we were ordering and that we were getting everything timely. Then came the training, and kudos to our poll workers. There's an honor to be had with poll workers that did show up amidst all the challenges and the fears that were being said. But you know what? Cleanliness, disinfecting and cleaning, and those guidelines that we set in place were followed. And we are so glad to say that during the primary runoff, we were able to test all these protocols that we had in place. And we didn't have absolutely not one poll worker or voter that did come forward and said that they had been exposed. So we're better prepared. We have doubled up on our PPEs. We have doubled up on everything that we have set in place so that, again, we move forward not knowing everything, but we do move forward better prepared. So there is no fear. If everyone follows these guidelines, if everyone makes sure that they have tested prior to coming to the poll location, and if we all work together, then we will vote and be safe together.
Yeah, on our side, first I'd like to echo a lot of Yvonne's sentiments, and many of those things, particularly around PPE and safety, have been paramount for us here in Harris County. But locations has been a large challenge for us, because when we looked at the projected turnout for November of 2020, with the knowledge that we needed to be safe and socially distant, and with the knowledge that this will be the first election that we'll have with no straight ticket voting, we decided that we needed to triple the number of early voting centers that we had. And in addition to needing to go out and find another 80 locations since 2016, we also need to make sure that they're large enough to accommodate the type of socially distant voting that we need to do here in 2020. And so there are some, highly esteemed, well-regarded historical locations that we've needed to move because they simply weren't large enough. But from there, it's been recruiting, making sure that we have more than 10,000, volunteer election workers for October and November. And we've been very, very, very pleased to see the outpouring of enthusiasm to be election workers here in Harris County. As of today, we have over 9,000 applications in, and more pouring in. But we're also thrilled to have the partnerships that we've seen here in Harris County around locations. You may have heard of the Toyota Center where the Houston Rockets play, serving as a voting center. NRG Arena, right across the parking lot from where the Texans play, serving not only as a voting center, but also as our entire elections headquarters. Places like the Houston Food Bank, so many houses of worship, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, that for the first time have opened their doors to serve a civic duty for the people of Harris County. And so we've been overjoyed to have those partnerships, and we know that they're critical if we're going to get through November together.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned straight ticket voting, and I do want to get a little bit more into that because I don't think we can have a conversation about this upcoming election without considering the impact of the loss of straight ticket voting this year. You know, this was a move championed by Texas Republicans a few years ago that will go into effect for the first time for this election. You all are trying to get folks in and out of the polling place as quickly as possible. But this year, voters will no longer be able to use one button to select every candidate in one party on their ballots. You also have a lot of the municipal elections that were delayed from May now also tacked on to the bottom of the ballot. How are you all working through this? I mean, how many is it repeating to voters that they should consider a sample ballot to prepare and come in with that to get in as quickly as possible? You know, what's the practical advice you give to a voter who may show up and there may be a longer line than they expected simply because people are taking longer to get through the ballot? And what's the advice for that voter? You know, some voters might be able to get in their car and drive to the next location over that might have a shorter line, but we know that for some voters that's not actually an option. So how are you working through this? What's the practical advice you give to a voter who will be the ones who ultimately feel the impact of the loss of straight ticket voting at the polling place?
Well, definitely, you said it right, Alexa. We are making sure that our voters are knowledgeable, and we are working with our IT department to create some software that will make a sample ballot easy to obtain. Because I think that's key. I always say over and over, every opportunity I get, do not let it be the first time that you see your ballot when you are there at the polling location ready to vote. You have to be an informed voter. It's not enough to just register to vote. It's paramount that you become knowledgeable. And so obtaining that sample ballot, viewing that sample ballot, and making your choices. What a lot of people don't know is that the law says that a sample ballot must be printed in yellow paper. You can print your sample ballot, you can mark your sample ballot, and you can take it with you to the poll location. As long as you're not, waving it around and using it as an electioneering gadget, you can actually unfold your sample ballot and utilize it, because you are absolutely right. There will be longer lines. We cannot have it both ways. We cannot tell our community, go out and vote, and then tell our community that they won't have to wait in line. They must be patient, they must be informed, and we will try our very, very best by being informed and doing this quickly to go in, to vote, to maximize the safety standards that are in place, and then allow the next voter to come in. But we can only do this by being informed. So it's very important. You said another thing, and I've already mentioned it. We've got those additional May elections that have come into the November election, along with those that are having their general election, the cities and schools and our college that are also having an election. So let's be informed. Let's call our offices, elections offices throughout the state. Make sure that you get your sample ballot and be a better informed voter when you head out to the polls.
Yes, and voters certainly need to be able to make a plan to vote, and that includes, downloading and filling out their sample ballot and taking it with them. But the most important message that we're sharing with voters is that the safest, the fastest, and the most convenient way to vote is to vote from home. And so, if you're eligible, we're encouraging all Harris County voters who are eligible to vote by mail to do so. Not only is it safer and more convenient for you, you can take the time that you need to complete your ballot from your dinner table or from your sofa. But it's also safer and more convenient for every other voter in person, because it's one less person in front of them in line and one less person who they could be exposed to during the time of this deadly virus. But for those who are not eligible to vote by mail, because Texas is one of only 6 states right now where all voters in the state are not allowed to vote by mail due to conditions around the coronavirus, we encourage you to vote early, because on election day, and perhaps even on those final days of early voting, those lines will be long. We know it without a doubt. And so if you can go earlier in the process, beginning on October 13th, to cast your ballot, it's much less likely that you're going to be in a line. And we also make on our website, we make it easy for you to find a location that's near to you that has the shortest line, because we know, again, some of these locations that are historically important or popular, those are going to be the ones that have the long lines. And there may be one just a block or two away that has no line at all. And so we're trying to do our best to encourage voters to vote in a way that's going to be safe and convenient for them.
Running out of time, but I did want to ask you all about the effect of what we all expect to be an increase in voting by mail. Chris, I know you sort of just gave us your elevator pitch that you were sharing with voters about trying to get as many people who are eligible to vote by mail as possible. Texas has fought to keep in place its strict eligibility rules for mail-in ballots. Chris, obviously, you've been in court recently because your county in particular is working to increase the number of people voting by mail by sending out those applications to every voter in the county. Yvonne, I know you are about to send applications to voters who are 65 and older after a commissioner's court vote. Given this increase in mail-in voting, the questions that have resulted are, how quickly are we going to get those election results? How long are we going to be waiting for those results to come in because we now have mail-in to come in? So just with the last a few seconds that we've got, I just wanted to ask each of y'all what this is going to look like. What should we expect? What should voters not consider a problem or not a doubt with the election just because the results might be a little bit slower to come in?
So we don't expect delay in reporting results at all. Our early voting ballot board is going to come in and start processing those ballots on October 14th, more than 2 weeks before the election. And so if you get your ballot back to us, and by the way, we're going to be sending ballots out just in the next week. And so you'll have 6 weeks to complete your ballot. Don't take all that time. Get it back to us as soon as possible, either through the mail or by dropping it off at a county clerk's office in person. And we're going to start processing that ballot. And at 7 p.m. on Election Day, we're going to announce the results of all of those mail-in ballots along with the rest of our early voting results.
And that's exactly right. We need our community to be quick and to be timely. If they do decide that voting by mail is their choice of voting, make sure that, like Chris says, you are able to bring that mail ballot into the main office. And in Hidalgo County, that's just one office. And so we have set up curbside drop-off. We have set up, of course, coming in to the office. And the sooner you bring it in, the sooner you mail it in, the better it will be, because Chris is right. Those ballots that are turned in timely will be part of the early vote total. And so there is no time to waste. There is only a time to act quickly and to make sure that your ballot gets to this office on time.
All right. Well, we are going to let you all get back to it. I know you've got quite a bit on your to-do list. So thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa.
I'm joined now by Mimi Marziani, who is the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project, a nonprofit organization that has filed many lawsuits on behalf of Texans who are unable to exercise their right to vote. And I'm also joined by Raven Douglas, who is the political director for Move Texas, a nonprofit focused on increasing civic engagement among young voters and advocating on their behalf. Thank you all for being here. Let's jump right into it. I know that the term exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic is one we have heard quite a bit over the last few months, but I want to talk about the elevated risks for disenfranchisement for the upcoming election in a state where we know an untold number of voters, particularly voters of color, are disenfranchised each election. What effects has the pandemic had on what you all have previously found to be broken about the voting process in Texas? And Raven, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, Alexa, things have already kind of been bad in Texas, but they seem to have gotten worse. And there are several things that kind of highlight the number of broken things that are going on in Texas right now. Is one, we don't have online voter registration. Most of the country has online voter registration. And in Texas, all of our voter registration was taking place in person, one-on-one, hand-to-hand. And so because of COVID and the need for social distancing, we're seeing that voter registration rates are declining all across the state. And so that's something that we are definitely paying attention to. Also, after the Shelby County versus Holder decision, we saw a number of polling locations close across the country. Over 1,600 of those polling locations closed across the country. 750 of those have closed here in Texas. And so as we see counties that are kind of strapped for money, we are deeply concerned that counties will choose to condense the number of polling locations instead of increasing the number, especially to spread voters out. And so those are kind of some of the things that we are seeing and kind of organizing around as we get ready for November. I think Harris County is a good example of ways that we are increasing voter accessibility instead of limiting it. They will have over almost 800 election day sites. They're planning to hire over 10,000 poll workers. And so this is a time where we need to be increasing voter accessibility, spreading out the number of voters that we have across our jurisdictions instead of condensing it and making it more difficult to vote.
Yeah, and I mean, I would agree with everything that Raven just said. If you zoom out, our big problem in Texas is that, unfortunately, the folks running the state of Texas made a cynical decision a couple years ago in particular, that it was to their political advantage to make voting and voter registration as difficult as possible. And so you have, rather than trying to be creative and innovative and fix some of our laws that have been on the books for too long and are now outdated, or use new technologies and incorporate best practices that we've seen in other places across the country, we've seen a resistance to that. And then, as Raven noted, when you layer COVID on top, it means that we have fallen far, far behind. And really, it's been not surprising, I guess, but very unfortunate to watch the reactions of state leaders in fighting tooth and nail to expand voting by mail during this pandemic, for instance. To watch Attorney General Ken Paxton double down on threats to prosecute voters and amazing groups like MOVE for making mistakes, rather than trying to find common sense solutions to making voting more accessible.
So let's talk about some of those changes that have happened. We spoke with local election officials just before this conversation, and I often find that they operate in this sort of weird space because they are responsible for carrying out elections, and many of the decisions they make could determine whether a voter may be disenfranchised, but they're also working within kind of the confines of what's left for them by the legislature and the governor and what a county commissioner's court may approve. Acknowledging that the state has made few changes to the voting process during the pandemic and to accommodate for those challenges, how would you rate the work counties have done so far to adjust? Raven, you mentioned Harris County was sort of going, maybe beyond what other counties are doing, but how would you rate this work so far, kind of more broadly and beyond Harris County?
Yeah, so I would rate it. I definitely would say if we're looking across the scope of Texas, Harris County is definitely number one. In addition to expanding the number of early voting sites and election day sites, they're piloting 7 24-hour polling locations. They'll be paying their poll workers anywhere between $17 to $20 an hour. And they have just really centralized and really, as Mimi mentioned, been very innovative in the way that we can do elections. And I think a lot of times people don't realize how much elections are how they're controlled at the county level. And so they have really kind of taken that power in their hands to really increase voter accessibility. But I think there are other counties that are kind of just in the middle of the road. I think, I would say probably Dallas County is kind of in the middle. Travis County, where Austin is kind of in the middle. And I think Hays County, from a kind of smaller, more rural example, where Texas State University is, they have a campus of about 45,000 students, has kind of done a good job of how to be innovative in a time where, again, they don't have that much money. It's a smaller county, and there are a lot of kind of rural areas in the neighborhood. But I think that, speaking kind of to the opposite side, something that we have seen is that we've seen a lot of challenges, particularly in Bexar County, where San Antonio is, and with the elections administrator there. That election administrator has just not been very receptive to being innovative, to trying new things. We originally saw their election order for November, and there were fewer polling locations than the 2018 midterm election. They only had accounted for 1,500 poll workers after they had already closed a dozen polling locations in the July runoff because of a lack of poll workers. And then there were just some things that just even violated the Texas election code. And so what we've been doing is working directly with the Commissioner's Court, because this is a time where commissioners should be holding elections administrators accountable. And we've kind of circumvented her. And Commissioner Justin Rodriguez in San Antonio has passed a resolution called the SMART resolution that does mandate, it mandated, for example, that the AT&T Center, where the San Antonio Spurs play, it mandated as an a election day site. It also did things like had the DA look into what it would look like to have a 24-hour polling location in San Antonio, as well as have multiple drop-off locations for vote by mail. So even if you're in a county where the elections administrator, who is kind of supposed to be this nonpartisan figure outside of government, even if they aren't kind of, adapting to the times, increasing voter accessibility, we've seen ways where we can kind of go around that issue and solve some of these problems. But again, it's not ideal.
Yeah, and I think that this actually speaks to one of the problems that you have when you have the lack of leadership at the state level. I mean, we are seeing a patchwork of approaches in the counties, and in the counties where election officials have more resources at their disposal, have been innovative. I think that's going to turn out pretty well for voters. But unfortunately, it means that voters are at the whim in many ways of these often exhausted, often under-resourced election workers. And on the polling place point that Raven raised, this is a huge concern. We have seen in Texas more than 750 polling places closed since the Shelby County decision of the Supreme Court in 2013 took away federal oversight. And so without federal oversight on polling place changes, and with the state not stepping into that void, counties have largely been left to police themselves. And the Texas Civil Rights Project has actually been working with community groups like MOVE to try to demand that sort of oversight. But it's a bit of a whack-a-mole situation because, we are outside the government. We don't always get information about polling places until, unfortunately, sometimes it's too late, or it forces us to bring things like election day litigation to try to remedy it.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about instances of disenfranchisement and, the efforts from the White House on down to sow mistrust in the election process. And I'm curious on your thoughts about how do we strike a balance in, say, standing by the integrity of an election and the knowledge that it's not always a fair process for some voters, whether that's a last-minute closure of their polling place, whether it's a voter who was unable to register in the first place, or a voter who doesn't have the documentation that they need to be able to bring the proper photo ID to the polling place. Like, is it the difference between someone winning because of widespread voter suppression versus someone winning even with widespread voter suppression? What's the balance there between those two, and how are y'all thinking about this as we head into this election?
Yeah, it's such an excellent point. I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, the democracy and the democratic process that we figured out in the United States is among the best in the world. And our elections are run overall with integrity and with accuracy. At the same time, they're not perfect. And, I personally have spent, as you noted, I spend my time suing the government. I spent a lot of time trying to force these election officials and our laws into the vision that I think is really set out for our country of fairness and justice. And I do think that we have a ways to go. But, the solution to that, in my view, is for all of us to come together and try to continue to improve our democracy. The solution is not to rip apart our democracy and, throw it out the window.
Yeah, I think you said it really well, Mimi. But I think the only thing I'll add to that is that, looking at studies, the two top reasons why young people don't vote is that, one, they feel like their vote doesn't matter, and two, voting is hard. And so when we talk about voting is difficult, Texas is one of the most difficult states to vote in, and studies show that, our experience working in counties show that, but it's not impossible. And so as we kind of talk to young people, as we talk to voters, we always try to explain to them that there are barriers. We're not going to lie about those barriers, but there are organizations like TCRP and MOVE and other community partners who are going to help them vote, because I think by voting and putting in place people who support pro-democracy and voting rights reform, we can work together to break down those barriers, but we have to go through the channels of our democracy in order to achieve that. And so it may take a few extra steps, but we can make it happen, and we can, do that through collective power building.
So starting from that place where so much of the burden is on the voter, even though voting is a fundamental right, we know it doesn't come easy to everyone. Starting from there, and the idea of it's on the voter to overcome these barriers, it's on the voter to sometimes go to court to fight some of these barriers. What is the practical advice that you all have for a voter who may be watching and thinking about, okay, how do I prepare to vote in this election, knowing it's unlike any other election I may have voted in, knowing that it might be the first election that I am voting in, and it might be harder than it normally would be had my first election been maybe 1 or 2 years ago. What's the practical advice that you all would offer to a voter right now about preparing for this round?
Yeah, I think my advice would definitely be, one, try to go towards the organizations that are offering that information. So, I think that Mimi will probably talk about election protection and what's happening there. So I won't kind of spoil what she's going to say, but I think kind of following organizations like MOVE or a number of different places that will have election information, checking your county elections department's website pretty regularly for any updates will be super important. But I think kind of my summary is just to do your research and do it early. Early voting has been extended by 3 weeks, so you can now begin voting as early as October 13th. Make your plan to vote early as soon as you can get access to the early voting locations in your county, because they may have changed. They have likely changed due to COVID. Make sure that, the identification that you're planning to use to vote, that it's accurate, that it hasn't expired, and all of that information. And just really make sure that, if you need to request your mail-in ballot, request it now. I think this is a time where we need to kind of be preparing as early as possible to ensure that we can mitigate some issues later down the line.
Yeah, 100% plus a million on everything Raven said. Make sure you have accurate information, make a plan. As Raven noted, the Texas Civil Rights Project spearheads a statewide election protection coalition. We work with dozens and dozens of community groups and election officials. We have information on our website, and we have a hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE, that voters can call with questions or to report any problems. But just to underscore again, there's a lot of bad information out there. And so going to government websites, going to trusted community partners like MOVE, like TCRP, like the Election Protection Coalition, and really arming yourself with the right information is absolutely the best place to start.
All right. Well, just before we go, very, very quickly, after this is over, we'll be headed into a legislative session. Who knows what that will look like, but we know we're heading toward one. Looking ahead to that session, what's at sort of the top of y'all's list for things that need to be reformed in a post-pandemic session, either things that have been identified as issues during this election or things that have always been issues, but have only been made worse or have been highlighted for how bad or how much of a barrier they can create for a voter. Acknowledging this is a legislature that focuses more on enacting voting regulations and pulling back on existing ones. Very quickly, each of you give me what's at the top of your list to bring to legislators when they come back in January.
I bet we have the same one. Raven, you go. Tell my theory.
Yeah, it's so many, but I guess to be quick, definitely reassessing online voter registration, ideally automatic voter registration, looking to expand the vote by mail requirements. Also, in the 2019 legislative session, there was a bill that passed that diminished or eliminated temporary polling locations, which has shuttered a lot of college polling locations. And so we'll be looking into that to not only kind of reverse that bill, but also to mandate polling locations on public universities.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the voter registration modernization cannot be underscored enough. I mean, as Raven started in the beginning, voter registration, which we do in Texas right now with pen and paper, has ground to a halt because it's the only thing left that we do with pen and paper. And then I think I would layer on top of that, especially without the Voting Rights Act anymore, we have to have processes in state to evaluate the effects of these laws. And I would really hope that lawmakers would take it upon themselves to put into place their own Voting Rights Act, to evaluate the effect that especially voting law changes are going to have on Black and Brown Texans before they are put into place. That would go a really long way to making me not to have to go into court quite so much.
All right. Well, Mimi and Raven, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to those of you who are watching. Please remember that the deadline to register to vote is October 5th and early voting starts October 13th. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, thank you all for watching.